Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're jumping headfirst into a topic that honestly feels like something straight out of a spy thriller.
It really does.
But it's very much real-world cybersecurity. And hey, if you're just joining us or you've been with us from the start, make sure you're subscribed, on your favorite podcast platform so you catch all our deep dives.
And speaking of catching things,
Yeah.
today we're trying to catch something that's, well, deliberately hard to spot. We're pulling back the curtain on what a lot of security folks call the ninja of the cyber attack world.
The ninja. Or I heard another great analogy in the sources, the ghost that slips through walls, right? Compared to traditional malware, which is more like the burglar that kicks down your front door.
Exactly. It's less about brute force, more about pure stealth.
So it's bypassing defenses differently.
Totally. And the key reason for that stealth, the core concept we really need to get up front, is that this kind of attack, it doesn't rely on files written to disk.
Okay.
It operates almost entirely
Right.
in memory.
In memory. So leaving, like, no smoking gun on the hard drive, that sounds, well, like a forensic nightmare.
It absolutely can be. Yeah, if you're only looking in the, let's say, traditional places, it's a fundamental shift from what, many classic security tools are even designed to detect.
All right, let's dive in then. You mentioned ghosts and ninjas. What exactly is fileless malware at its heart? I mean, how does it manage this Houdini act of, not touching the disk?
Well, at its core, it's malware that doesn't live in a traditional file format. So no executable like a .exe or a script file or a .dll
Right.
that you'd normally save and run from your hard drive. Instead, it executes directly in the system's volatile memory, the RAM.
Okay, but doesn't everything run in memory eventually? Like, what makes the specific approach different?
That's a really good question, and it gets to the cleverness of it. See, normal programs load from a file on disk into memory to run fileless malware. It's injected or executed directly into memory. Often, it piggybacks on legitimate processes that are already running there.
So it skips that whole save file to disk first step.
It bypasses that initial disk-based stage entirely. Yep.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me. How does it get into memory without a file? And I mean, what does it actually do once it's there?
Well, it abuses built-in system tools.
Yeah.
Think about things like PowerShell or Windows Management Instrumentation, WMI, or even just legitimate admin frameworks.
Okay.
So instead of bringing its own malicious tools, the burglar's crowbar, it uses the system's own tools and resources, like the homeowner's own ladder and key, kind of.
Oh, right. Living off the land, basically.
Exactly. That's where the term living off the land binaries, or LOL bins, comes from. Attackers use these trusted system executables, like PowerShell.exe, WMI.exe, maybe MSDShay.exe, or Rundle32.exe.
Tools that are already supposed to be there.
Yes, tools that are already allowed to run by your system's security policies. So their malicious use is much, much harder to spot amidst all the normal activity.
So it's not the tool itself that's bad, it's the way it's being used. And that usage happens without leaving, like, a standard malicious file sitting on the disk.
Precisely. So think about it. An antivirus scanner that's looking for known malware signatures in files on your disk drive. It's completely blind to this.
Yeah.
It's like the security guard meticulously checking everyone's ID at the front door, while the ninja climbed in the window using the house's own scaffolding.
Wow. Okay. Given that level of stealth, how do these attacks even kick off? What's a common entry point that leads to this memory-only execution?
Well, one of the most prevalent initial vectors our sources highlight is still phishing, good old phishing.
Okay.
A malicious email arrives,
Yeah.
often with what looks like a harmless attachment, maybe a Word doc or an Excel file.
And I bet those documents have macros involved somewhere.
You got it.
Yeah.
If the user gets tricked into enabling those macros, the macro doesn't just drop an executable file.
No. What then?
Instead, it contains a short script. Often it's obfuscated, hidden. And that script launches a system tool, like PowerShell.
Ah, okay.
Then that PowerShell command reaches out, downloads the actual malicious payload, and executes it directly into the memory of, say, the PowerShell process itself. Or maybe it injects it into another legitimate process running nearby.
So wait, the malware payload itself never touches the disk as a distinct file? It's just downloaded and run straight into RAM?
That's the critical piece. Exactly. It runs as this sort of quiet session, often hiding inside a legitimate process, which makes it incredibly difficult for those traditional file scanning security tools to even detect its presence at that initial execution phase.
Okay, so we've got the entry point, the initial code execution happening in memory, no file dropped. What happens next? Like,
Yeah.
how does the attack chain unfold if the attacker is operating like a ghost in the machine?
Right. So once they have that foothold in memory, even if it's temporary, they use it. They perform reconnaissance. They try to establish persistence.
Okay, persistence. How do they do that without a file?
Well, the persistence method itself might still be fileless, like writing a malicious script into a registry key.
A registry key. Okay, so still not a traditional .exe file.
Exactly. It's just data within the system's configuration database, not a separate program file. So this registry key script might get executed every time the system boots, maybe triggered by a legitimate process, or they could even leverage something like WMI event subscriptions to schedule execution. Again, no file.
Clever. Okay, so persistence is established, maybe filelessly. What then? What does operating purely in memory let them do across the network?
Pretty much anything a traditional attacker would do, just stealthier.
Right.
They can open reverse shells, connecting back to their command and control server. They could extract credentials directly from memory. They can Mimikatz loaded straight into RAM.
Ooh, nasty.
Yeah. Map the network, move laterally to other systems.
And all this activity, the scanning, the credential theft, moving around, it's primarily happening using those legitimate system tools, the LOL bins or injected code, just running in memory, not by dropping new malware files on every machine they touch.
For the most part, yes. That's the goal. They might drop tools occasionally if they absolutely have to, but the primary objective is to perform actions that leave minimal traces on the disk drive. It makes forensic investigation significantly harder.
Yeah, I can see that.
Imagine trying to prove someone was in a room if they left 0 footprints, didn't touch anything identifiable, and just vanished like smoke.
That picture really hammers home the challenge. Let's connect this to the real world for a second. This isn't just theoretical, right? We've actually seen major incidents where these fileless techniques were absolutely key.
Oh, absolutely. This isn't just some lab experiment. One of the most widely known examples has got to be the 2017 Equifax breach.
Right, Equifax. Huge data breach. I remember that one. But how does that link specifically to fileless methods?
Well, the initial compromise exploited a vulnerability in the Apache Struts web application framework.
Okay.
But the attackers didn't just exploit that flaw to, say, upload a malicious web shell file, which is kind of the traditional route.
What did they do instead?
They used the vulnerability to inject malicious code directly into the memory of the web server process itself.
Ah, okay. Straight into memory.
Yeah, and that allowed them to gain their initial access and start executing commands without writing files to disk on that compromised server, at least not at that crucial first stage.
So right at the point of entry, they were basically invisible to standard file-based detection. Yeah, that's a powerful illustration. What about cybercrime groups? Are they actively using these methods?
Definitely. Our sources document groups like FI7 quite extensively. They're notorious for their sophisticated use of fileless techniques.
FIN7, right.
Yeah, in attacks against hundreds of businesses, particularly in hospitality and retail sectors. They stole millions and millions of credit card numbers using these methods.
Wow. How did FIN7 typically operate using fileless? What were their go-to methods?
They relied really heavily on PowerShell for execution, and they often used something called reflective DLL injection.
Reflective DLL injection? What's that?
It's a technique where a malicious DLL, a dynamic link library, is loaded directly into a process's memory, maybe from a remote source or even from like a byte array stored within a script locally.
But crucially,
without the DLL file itself ever being saved to the disk.
Got it. So they're running custom code, their own malicious code, but it only exists within the memory space of some other probably legitimate process.
Precisely. It's incredibly evasive. FIN7 would use this to inject their bad code into processes like, say, Explorer.exe or WMI.exe, making their tools just blend in, appearing as part of normal system activity. Sneaky.
Any other notable examples of these specific fileless methods, maybe something focusing on persistence?
Yeah. A classic one, maybe a few years older now, is the Fileless Malware family.
Oh.
Yeah. Its primary persistence mechanism wasn't a file on disk at all. It stored its malicious script, maybe JavaScript or VB script, directly inside a specific registry key.
The registry again, so that seems to be a recurring theme.
It is. It's a common hiding place. So a legitimate process, like rundle32.exe, would be launched often via a scheduled task or maybe a run key, also specified in the registry. And it would just be instructed to execute the script content directly from that registry key.
Right.
So again, no traditional malware executable file needed for persistence or even for execution startup.
What really stands out to me in these examples, Equifax, FI, and 7 Powlix, is that the fileless aspect wasn't just like a minor part of the attack. It was fundamental. It was how they got in or stayed hidden or ran their core malicious stuff.
Exactly right. The absence of that standard file footprint on the disk was a huge factor in delaying detection and response in these cases. Traditional security tools, traditional forensic methods, they were looking for the burglar's tools left behind. But the ninja had just used the house's own furniture and then, put it back perfectly.
Okay, well, this raises the big flashing question then. If these attacks are ghosts, right, operating in memory, using legitimate tools, leaving hardly any disk traces, how on earth do defenders and forensic investigators actually catch them? What are the techniques?
This is where the whole security and forensic mindset has really had to shift, dramatically in some ways, because the primary evidence isn't on the disk anymore. Memory analysis becomes absolutely critical.
Memory analysis, you mean literally looking at the raw contents of the system's RAM at a specific point in time, like a snapshot?
Precisely. Tools like volatility or recall are pretty much indispensable here. They allow investigators to capture that snapshot, a memory dump of the system's volatile memory. And then that dump can be examined offline, carefully.
And what are you looking for in that? I imagine it's a massive dump of data. What are the signs?
Yeah, it's huge. You're hunting for anomalies, things that just shouldn't exist in a normal, healthy state. So that could be evidence of injected code sitting inside legitimate processes, or maybe suspicious process handles, or network connections originating from unexpected places, or even just command lines associated with processes that clearly indicate malicious use of those LOL bins, even if the commands themselves were executed purely from memory. You're essentially looking for the ninja's fingerprints inside the house's walls, within the memory structures.
So you're analyzing the live state, or at least the very recent history held in RAM, not just the persistent data sitting on the disk.
It's a totally different dimension of evidence.
Yeah.
And this is also why endpoint detection and response tools, EDR tools, they're not really optional anymore. They're crucial.
Right, EDR.
Because EDR tools aren't just looking for malicious files. They're constantly monitoring system behavior.
So tracking what processes are doing, what commands are being run, which network connections are being made, regardless of whether a new file actually got created.
Exactly. And EDR can spot that, hey, winword.exe, Microsoft Word unexpectedly spawned PowerShell.exe. And then that PowerShell.exe executed some weird, long encoded command string, or maybe made an unusual network connection out to a strange IP address. That behavioral chain is visible to the EDR, even if 0 malicious files were dropped onto the disk.
Okay, this is where detailed logging must come into play as well, then.
Right. Absolutely essential. Tools like Sysmin System Monitor, if you configure them correctly, they are invaluable. Sysmin provides incredibly detailed logs of critical system events, like every process creation, every network connection, every command line executed, parent-child process relationships, even registry modifications.
So even if the malicious code itself is hiding purely in memory, Sysmin can log the action it took or the legitimate tool it launched to do something bad.
Yes, exactly. You can often reconstruct the attack narrative just by following the breadcrumbs in those logs.
Yeah.
You piece it together, okay, this process started here, then it launched this suspicious command, that command connected to this IP address, that connection resulted in this further activity. You're building the picture from the system's activity diary, essentially, rather than finding a weapon left at the scene.
Makes sense.
And analyzing PowerShell logs specifically, and just the broader Windows event logs for unusual activity patterns, that becomes paramount.
This brings up a really critical point for incident response, then. If the primary evidence is in volatile memory,
then speed is absolutely everything. If you suspect a fileless attack is underway, you must isolate the system involved and perform a memory capture immediately.
Before rebooting or shutting down?
Absolutely. RAM content is lost the moment the system powers down or restarts. If you wait, your primary evidence source could literally just vanish. Poof. It's like the ghost disappearing the second you turn the lights on.
Okay, so we've talked about catching them after the fact or during. But how do organizations get ahead of this? What does, prevention and defense look like against these memory-resident threats?
It really requires a fundamental shift in defensive strategy. You have to move beyond just scanning for known bad files. You have to start actively monitoring system behavior and system activity.
Right. It's not enough to just have the burglar alarm looking for a forced entry. You kind of need internal cameras watching what people are actually doing inside the house.
That's a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
Security Operations Center teams, SOC teams, they need specialized training now. They need to be able to identify suspicious usage patterns of those legitimate system tools, those LOL bins we talked about.
Like what kind of patterns?
Well, when is it actually normal for PowerShell to execute a heavily encoded command? Almost never. When is it normal for your PDF reader to suddenly launch a command prompt? Again, almost never. These are red flags.
So setting up specific behavioral-based alerts becomes crucial.
Absolutely critical. You need alerts configured for things like processes spawning other processes they really shouldn't, like your example, acrobat.exe, launching cmd.exe, launching PowerShell.exe, that's weird, or excessive or unusual PowerShell command lines, especially those encoded ones or super long ones, or scripts being executed from weird locations like temporary internet folders, or modifications to those critical registry keys often used for persistence.
And looping back, if disk evidence is minimal, having robust logs is just non-negotiable.
Underlining the absolute necessity of maintaining robust logs and keeping them for a sufficient amount of time, log retention is key. Sysmin logs, PowerShell logs, Windows event logs, your EDR telemetry. This is your historical record, when the disk drive itself offers very little. Without these logs, trying to reconstruct a fileless attack chain becomes nearly impossible.
So what does this all mean for, for you listening? It sounds like the big takeaway for anyone involved in cybersecurity or even just trying to protect their own systems is that you really can't just rely on the old methods anymore. You almost have to think like the ninja yourself.
You really do. You have to shift your perspective. Move away from just protecting against something bad being placed on your system, like a file, and move towards watching what your system is actually doing in real time. Looking for those subtle signs of legitimate tools being used in illegitimate, unexpected ways.
Well, that was definitely a deep dive into the world of fileless malware. It's stealthy, it's intelligent, and it certainly poses a significant challenge. But, as we've discussed, by shifting our focus to memory and behavior, detection and defense are absolutely within reach.
Definitely possible. And next time on the deep dive, we're getting foundational. We're tackling F is for forensic imaging, capturing the crime scene.
Nice. So make sure you're following us at Forensic on social media for updates and maybe some extra insights. And of course, catch us on your favorite podcast platform.
And here's maybe a final thought for you to consider after this discussion.
Yeah.
Just because the threat isn't written neatly to disk doesn't make it any less real or, frankly, any less dangerous.
Stay curious.
And stay careful out there.
Catch you next time.